Right. Now we've started recording. Thank you all and welcome to the second in our series Wild Talks. This is Marcha Johnson from City College of New York, and she'll be talking about designing for coastal change. Before I leave the floor to Marcha and before her to Zeynep, I just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about our studio this semester. This semester we are teaching a graduate studio in architecture, design research studio called Rewilding the Metropolis. And we are looking at ecological threats or pressures on metropolises and big cities, especially on Istanbul. And we're looking at the threats posed to the ecosystems, several ecosystems, by the pressures of growth-centered and anthropocentric approaches. And we are at present just making some cartographic analysis and trying to understand the extent of damage, but also the possibilities and potentials of our city, Istanbul. And we are also looking at New York as a case, it's a case study, because there are lots of really interesting projects, both in terms of taking inventory of the natural history of the city and also about the new developments. So thank you so much, Marcha, for agreeing to come to our talk series, and I'll leave the floor to Zeynep. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Edith. Thank you, Marcha. So let me just introduce her work briefly. Marcha Johnson is a landscape architect who specializes in ecological restoration and the design of post-industrial waterfront parks in urban areas. Marcha works for the New York City Parks Department, but today she is not representing the department or the city in any way. She teaches at the City College of New York, Spitzer School of Architecture for many years. Her professional focus has been designing habitat-rich, multi-purpose and water infrastructures and restoring ecological functions in damaged landscapes, including marine ecosystems, which we think are really relevant to the case of Istanbul. Marcha has a very unusual background. She has a BA, undergrad studies. She did her undergrad studies in biology, master's in landscape architecture, and PhD in city and urban planning, which I think gives her work a unique edge. She recently co-edited the book Coastal Change, Ocean Conservation and Resilient Communities, which is a collection of essays and design case studies that explore best practices for adapting to dynamic waterfront conditions while incorporating nature conservation in urban coastal areas and also considering climate change in the imminent danger of climate change. So she will speak about 45 minutes, and if you have questions, please save them for the Q&A. And now please join me in welcoming Marcha Johnson.
Thank you, thanks. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, share. Okay, so I'm going to show some examples of my own work and also of others from around the world, but my main objective today is to talk a little bit about the ocean, the connection between architecture and ocean conservation. Most architects, if they are working on the waterfront, are much more concerned about the land than they are about the water. And that's completely understandable. This is where we live, we humans. However, when we work on the edge of water bodies, we have an impact on them. And we, with a bit of understanding, with a bit of care, we can make our hard structures much more biologically rich and help to support the marine life, which are our neighbors. In many cultures, the ocean is considered our mother, and from a scientific perspective, there's a lot of truth in that. It's where we all originated. The life of the world originated in the water, in the salt water. And we have an obligation to recognize the damages that we've done to the ocean, its fisheries, its coral reefs, all of the life that lives there, to recognize the relationship of the human world on the ocean, and to see what we can do to make it better. And in many respects, when we make the environment better for other life, we make it better for ourselves. So what we're looking at in this photograph is a project that I helped to usher into existence with many, many partners. This Harlem River Park, constructed in about 2009, that includes, what we're looking at is a tide pool. This little area here, this is the Harlem River, which is a saltwater body. This underneath is all porous. This is gabions that lets water go back and forth underneath, even underneath this pavement, and changed a traditional linear hard edge to one which is porous, or at least partially porous, and illustrates a variety of conditions for others to study and to learn how to do these kinds of projects instead of just replacing standard seawalls. So some of the ideas, this is the same project that we're looking at. This is a little strip of salt marsh and a series of terrace setbacks, which was a dramatic difference. Even though it's a tiny little area, this is probably a meter or a meter and a half. But instead of having a straight line, we have a setback line, a zigzag line. And instead of having a uniformly straight vertical, we have a series of terraces, including a little salt marsh. So looking at these shorelines that have porosity, that have green space incorporated into it, have attachment sites for shellfish, which provide habitat for fish in the water to come and nibble as they go along, and to adjust the impact of wave and wake activity on the shoreline, which is kind of a destructive force from the water, to adjust that so that it's less destructive, is not more expensive than doing things the traditional way. Human lives are at stake, where we have many cities around the world are concentrating populations in the most vulnerable coastal areas. The ocean ecology, of course, is at stake in that we have looked at fish populations crashing around the world, and many of the nursery spawning areas where fish that we eat and which other fish eat have been compromised. Also, the fishing style, which disturbs the bottom, has been a major impact on the life in the ocean. But one thing that's real of ownership, who owns the land along the shore? The way that we think of this as being owned by humans is has colored the fact that the ocean and the shore are one and the same thing. The ocean rises up, the shoreline sometimes is dry, sometimes wet, but our idea that this is somehow dry land for development, in the same way that inland, upland areas are dry land for development, has colored and obstructed our understanding of how these shoreline spaces work, and has put our populations at risk. And we usually leaving out ocean conservation when we think about what to do with these. And we can do better than that. We're at a moment where lots of things are changing. We're at a moment of crisis throughout the world, but those kinds of moments are known to be the ones that drive innovation, that drive evolution to the next level. So if we survive this moment as a world culture, my vision, my hope, my mission is to try to encourage us to live in a better, more harmonious, more productive and sustaining way with our ocean partner, our ocean neighbor. So what's wrong with the traditional seawalls? These are photos from New York. This is a very typical situation. We have a hard esplanade sort of space next to a completely vertical wall, very straight, with a big railing to prevent people from ever getting into the water or touching the water. So the water is viewed around most of the city as something to be kept away and dangerous. You don't want to have people falling over. It's fast moving, or it can be fast moving. And if you ever fall in, there's no way to get out. In addition, the structures are often degraded, especially below the waterline, because as industry left, the people who would have maintained these for shipping are doing other things. And so these sites have been let to rust and degrade. Even our new waterfronts, this is Battery Park City during 9/11, when people were being evacuated from Manhattan by boat. Very difficult to even get access for a boat to these waterfronts. So it's kind of crazy. We created a whole series of structures around our waterfronts which don't serve the possibility of even using the water for access and for escape. And so there's another typical look. We also have made our shorelines so rigid and so inflexible that the only way they move is to fall apart, to be destroyed by erosion and wave action. Whereas in nature, this type of shoreline that edges between water and land are flexible, porous, have a variety of levels, and are able to be a big connector between the life of the water and the life of the land. So we have these collapsing fisheries around the world. I don't mean to be, focusing on the negative, but it just to sort of set the stage for how urgent it is for architects and other designers and developers to think about what the edges that they are designing, especially something like your proposed canal. Not you aren't necessarily proposing it, but the proposed canal for Istanbul. The illustrations that I've seen about that look very harsh and hard-edged. So we have these collapsing fisheries around the world. These are two local fish that have gone from fairly dynamic and sustainable populations in the 80s to unsustainable populations in the 2000s. So one of the things that I did a few years ago was to try to, in preparation for doing Harlem River Park, was to ask the question, how do we do this better? And who would know how to do this? And where could we find examples for ways to have shorelines that are different and able to be more alive? So one thing that I did was I looked for natural models, and I'm going to show you two or three of these. There's a series. So one of them is learning from beach. So how do beaches move? They're not rigid. They move around, they tumble, they're flexible materials, they're very durable. Beaches have endured all kinds of storms, every kind of possible monsoon and hurricane. Does not destroy beaches, but actually builds them, although they may move around. So this has its natural adjustment mechanisms, which typically are completely absent in architectural shorelines. And they're in zones. They're not all one monolithic thing. There's a lot of different types of organisms that occupy different types of zones. They flood and they have wet areas, and they're not zoned so that it's always dry or always wet. There's a lot of flexibility in the level of water. And there are a lot of takeaways, learning examples, lessons that can be learned from beaches. Another thing we can learn from are shells. So in a typical seawall, the water beats against the wall, and this is causes a lot of reflectivity, which means the wave bounces back, and that causes a lot of impact and stress. It splashes, and it has a current, sets up a current that scours the toe of the wall. So we often have to, almost always have to, barricade that bottom with toe stones. So we not only build walls, but we destroy or damage or change the shoreline adjacent to it. Whereas many shells have laminar flow. They're aerodynamically shaped so that when water comes this way, it flows over the shell and doesn't destroy it. Now, shells are a tiny, tiny fraction of the thickness of a wall like this. But these types of shells are able to withstand the water, not by resisting it, but by allowing it to flow over them and around them. Shellfish clusters, which are in the most turbulent, most stressful environments of the world, where the pounding surf is constantly adjusting and changing and aerating, but also putting a lot of force on the structures there. The shellfish that have evolved to live in these spaces have also very thin shells, but they've done some clever things to make those shells more stronger. One of them is they're in fractal form, so that we have little shells and big shells making clusters that are magnified at different scales. In addition, you see these little lines here. That's a corrugated system where the shell magnifies its strength by having corrugations, the way we do corrugated cardboard or corrugated metal roofs. So shells are able to, by doing this and by having this shape that they have and the way they're clustered, the ability to withstand these turbulent areas without being pulverized. And there are more examples of that as well. We can also learn from traditional cultures all around the world. There have been people living on shorelines for thousands and thousands of years. Some of those ancient cultures are now are archaeological sites underwater because they were flooded out. But many cultures that evolved along shorelines learned, developed, and innovated ways to live there so that they didn't get destroyed. And there are a lot of wonderful examples that we can look at around the world for how to live better, how to have urban environments that are not as rigid and are more mobile and more nimble and have different types of structures in the area of most stress. We can learn a lot from looking at what traditional cultures have done. So here are some examples of ways to have shorelines that support life along them, or in fact incorporate life within the actual structure. So bioengineering is a combination of living, rooting, branching, green vegetation, plus rigid or traditional non-living structures. So this is a thing called a green wall. It's a series of stacked concrete frames that allow plants to grow through. This is a typical wooden pile, which we no longer do in wooden piles because of the destructive ability of shipworms and gribbles, which are larvae that will eat the wood. But when you have wood piles, a lot of marine organisms can attach to them, not just because they're wood, but because they're rough and they have soft enough structure that organisms can get a foothold, get a handhold on those, on the wood. So there's other materials that we could use, which are not as vulnerable to being decayed, but have some roughness or have some flexibilities to allow organisms to attach. This is a more recent project in Elliott Bay at low tide. They created a series of walls that are textured and varied in order to support the salmon populations that move through that urban waterway. These structures are now covered with marine organisms that the young salmon can can eat as they move through on their way to the ocean. This is an example from Australia where tide pools were incorporated as part of a stormwater treatment program. These are gabions, which are cages, basically networks, netting or frames of rock that enclose rocks that allow vegetation to grow all over them. This is in Panama. This is built into a seawall where there's a little tide pool that allows shallow water and sediment to occupy space as part of the wall. That same general area, there are pockets in these walls, like drawers in a chest, where there are tide pools back in that little shady pocket. So that even though the wall is not compromised at all, the wall has the ability to support starfish and other marine organisms that can that would otherwise occupy voids and little caves in a natural rocky wall. These are called oyster castles, and they're concrete structures that encourage oysters to grow on them, and they're being used to create living reefs and also to protect some shorelines from wave action. So I'm going to show you a few examples now from Harlem River Park. This is its location in New York City. There's Manhattan, that's Central Park in there, if you know where that is. So Harlem River is this little waterway here. That's an aerial photograph of it before construction. It's a canal. It was a river at one time, but all of the wetlands have been hardened, and the edges, there's a railroad track that runs along this way, and all of the red edges have been hardened. And a little skinny strip of this is green parkland. And we were asked to take a look and rebuild the shoreline. And as an opportunity, we took this to try to do an experiment to see what kind of porous edges could be used to replace the standard steel piling that was there before. So what's the big deal about porous edges? So in a natural floodplain, the water is in the river, but also underground. This is a groundwater table. And as the water level changes in a tidal cycle, the water in the upper portion gets saturated and unsaturated. So this is constantly going up and down. And there are a series of terraces along the edge so that the water is not one constant depth. When we urbanize or make that into a canal, we harden the edges, we stop this interface exchange with the storage area, groundwater storage area of the ground, and we make this all high and dry, and all of the water is contained in this, so when it floods, it spills out over into the adjacent areas. And a way that this can be overcome and to make better use of the potential flood storage area in these under the city is to make these walls porous. You still have the ability to have shipping, but instead of resisting the water, you allow it to come back to something more similar to its natural state. So looking at Harlem River Park and the possibility of different types of shorelines, I collaborated with a marine engineering team from Stevens Institute to help build some models of what different possibilities could be like. And then we tested these models in a wave tank, which is usually used for understanding how boats move through the water and designing naval architecture. But in this case, we had a model builder build plastic models that we could then pull through this wave tank and see how water responded to them. So here we are in the wave tank. This was at a place in Long Island. So the wave tank is it's a long, like a swimming pool of constant depth. It's a long pool with a whole lot of fancy equipment over the top of it. So we attached our model to it, and then to simulate the wave action, there's a paddle at one end of this that causes waves, and you can move the model along this track with all kinds of wires to see how the water velocity changes along it. and analyze its interaction with the water. So the take-home message of this was that here we have a wave coming in, splashing against this the terrace wall, which became our gabion system. They released dye into the water to see how the flow would change, and this is a demonstration of the area that you'll see in a second as it becomes the terrace tide pool area. The dye will pool in that little cove instead of just moving by. So it slows down and collects in any area where the vertical seawall has been changed to a shallower area, and which breaks up that linearity of it. So that's what that looks like in construction. This was the before picture where we had this hard edge that was had holes underneath the water, which was allowing the upland to leak out essentially into the Harlem River and cause sinkholes. And now it's all porous under there, and that's where the water as it flows by will slow down and collect before it moves on. We also collaborated with another agency to do a second section of Harlem River Park. So this is where the river is, and this is the area where we planned to do what's called a green wall, which you saw a minute ago. It's a stack of concrete open frames. And that was accomplished by our sister agency. So this is what those green walls look like at the manufacturing site. This is a mock-up to see, kind of to practice how we might plant it and how they might look and so on, what type of stone we should put in it. And then this is it in construction here, those frames. They had to construct a kind of grid in order to work over them because this is over the water. So they're set on concrete footings. And this is what it looks like after construction with some plants growing on it and decorative boulders to try to help make a transition to the upland area where there are other boulders. And there's a little walkway along the edge that's for just pedestrians. And then here's our regular bikeway esplanade along the whole length of the thing. We also looked at the idea of tidal pools. So in a nutshell, the community in this area of East Harlem are primarily African American and Latino, and they did not have a tradition of swimming, of learning to swim, of teaching their children to swim or swimming in the rivers or even in swimming pools. They were very afraid of the water, and most of the adults as well as the children did not know how to swim, so they did not want to have access to the water. They did not want to be able to get even their toes wet because they're afraid of the water. It had been kind of culturally imposed upon them that the water is dangerous, which it can be, but it's also, it's not always dangerous, and it can be a great source of recreation, and just it's part of the world of our waterfront city. So we looked at examples of tide pools. This was a suggestion from a brilliant artist, Jackie Bruckner, to look at doing tide pools, which are safe. You can dabble your feet in them, and you can look at the organisms that live there without a fear of drowning. So here we are in construction, digging out the area behind what would have been the standard linearity of the wall, making a shallow area. There are slots. There's a slot, there's a slot. There's slots in this wall so that when the river water rises up, it fills this up to about 6 or 7 inches. And then when the water is at low tide, this is dry. So it's an alternating wet, dry condition like tide pools are. We also looked at doing using gabions as porous edges. This is a structural detail of it. It needed to be able to sit on the mud bottom without sinking. So one of our engineers developed an idea of creating a footing for this using boulders and marine concrete. And that's what that looks like in construction. We left the old seawall there to help keep the water out during construction, more or less out. It was constantly being inundated and constantly being pumped out, but it did help to have that to break the wave activity while we were under construction. Here they're building the cages of mesh. In addition to rock, we also placed shell to encourage shellfish to attach to other shellfish. And they were hand packed so that they have a minimal of abrasion against the wire edges. And here we are in construction, and there it is in the finished design. Everyone wanted to know, was this more expensive than doing a traditional concrete or steel wall? And the answer was no. If you look at the square footage of the face of the wall, it's right in there with our traditional methods. And if you look at it from some other aspects, which is maybe ease of construction and flexibility and the ability to do it in modules, it could be even less than a traditional method. So I'm going to talk now for a little bit about adding ecological enhancement to hard structures, which is something that I'm currently working with our engineering group on. We have a series everywhere. You see these little push pins. There are either a current or a future project to rebuild collapsing infrastructure along our waterfront. This is Harlem River here, and this is what's called the Upper East River. And we have, for the most part in New York, we have fairly good water quality, but in these areas, there is impairment from low dissolved oxygen during portions of the year when it's hot. So we have this cluster of projects, and we're looking at doing a series of innovations where we add ecological enhancement to traditional piles in different ways along the different sites, so that collectively we'll now have a demonstration of a variety of conditions and projects, add-ons that we can evaluate and compare and see if we want to do it, scale it up for future things. So some of the ideas are from other places. This is from the company called Deltaris in the Netherlands, to add what's called rich revetment instead of just a standard stone revetment, to add some plates that have holes and textures that are different shapes and different materials, and so on. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I can send this as a PDF to Zainab if you want to have a copy of it. Anyway, variety of ways to change the standard riprap to a place that is more inhabitable by organisms. There's another material which is in the market right now, developed by two marine biologists from Israel, called eco-concrete, and it's a concrete formula that weathers into more benign materials in ocean water than standard concrete, and which has a higher pH, so that or it has a pH that's closer to shellfish, so it attracts organisms, marine organisms, to occupy them. So these are some time-lapse photographs of the same tide pool over the course of a few months, and showing how it develops a living crust. At Brooklyn Bridge Park, the same eco-concrete was used to wrap piles with forms that have lots of texture on them, and then fill the inside of the jacket or form with eco-concrete, and take the forms off. They can be reused many times. And compared with standard piles, this is what those look like. Standard piles would still be looking kind of like this with very minimal attachment. But these concrete piles with lots of texture immediately over just a few months developed a living crust of marine organisms that support the aquatic environment. So some of the things we're looking at to do in the East River include reef balls, which are concrete structures, and these have been around for a long time. It's not super innovative, but one thing that it has been used less for is enhancing dissolved oxygen. So these holes, traditionally these are used to create reefs with shellfish attachment, but in our situation, we have shallow water that has low oxygen in these summer season. So the holes here are shaped like they have a V-shaped profile, like a Venturi effect for windows, where wind moves past a Venturi window and is drawn by the shape of the edges into the inside of the building. These sort of Venturi effect holes draw water into the interior of the reef ball. So we're going to set them so that at the upper level, where it's close to the surface, the oxygen-rich water is drawn and sucked into these reef balls and will oxygenate passively without any pumps or any other use of energy. We use the force of the water itself and the shape to reintroduce rich oxygen to the lower levels of the East River. We're also looking at these things called eel mops, which looks like ponytails. They're very, very low tech. It's just shredded material that young eels, baby eels, need to hide in, and they can just be tied to something. And this is an example of just a textured wall. Instead of having standard concrete, just scratch it, scrape it, have some crenellations or some roughened surfaces, and it changes immediately into something more like a weathered rock wall. Another thing that I did a few years ago was collaborate with a team that was looking at greening the standard guidelines that the Army Corps of Engineers calls for shoreline protection. Because of increased storms, a lot of shoreline communities are looking to stay put, but protect themselves from big crashing waves. I think it's going to be a losing battle. Ultimately, houses like this that are next to a beach are going to need to move inland and upland, but temporarily they're looking at extending the life of those structures by building revetments on the shoreline that have almost no habitat value. So we're looking at how can we make those better? If we have to have that kind of thing, how can we make it more livable? And a couple of ideas are just by changing the shape of it so that there's variety, and adding pockets so that it can be full of plants instead of just bare rock. Another thing that people are looking to do more increasingly is to do more concrete seawalls. And instead of having just a straight seawall, one of the ways that this could be made more biologically useful is by changing it to curvilinear, which makes more pockets and more micro conditions than this standard straight line, and making pockets without compromising the effect of the wall, making pockets so that it can be full of plants instead of just all concrete, making it multiple purpose. Looking at changing standard revetment to one which has a variety of different sizes and shapes and pockets of voids, different kinds of voids, different angles of repose, various substrates will give it also more micro conditions. And lastly, a project that my students have worked on a couple of years ago in Newtown Creek, which is a tributary to the East River, so saltwater again and tidal again. There's a old building which is being used for new manufacturing and sort of startups right next to the canal. And we were looking, and this was all collapsing, so we're looking at ways to rebuild this edge in ways that will make it more green. And so those are some ideas about having set pockets built into the wall, make it available for humans to enjoy and walk along, and increase the porosity of it. So a couple examples from my book, which were from other designers, other places. This is in the west coast of the United States, where a project was done to replace a shoreline that was narrow and had very steep and had parking along it, to one which is where they pulled the parking back farther away, made a boardwalk, reshape that shoreline so that it's gradual and doesn't erode so much, so it doesn't have to be barricaded so much, and made the whole location into a more benign interface between the human activities and the adjacent tidal waterways. And at the same time, cleansing the water by having wetland areas that are able to oxygenate and remove some of the contaminants out of water. So one of the things that we're dealing with in the United States and many other places as well is the fear of water as being the enemy, to be kept away and separated from us, getting beyond the language of fear to respect it, to understand how it works, but also to enjoy learning about it is a critical part of changing the way cities deal with their the neighbor that they have of the water on the other side of the waterfront. So a couple of other projects that I've been directly involved with, one was incorporating flexibility in an urban shore. Many urban shores need to be rigid for a variety of reasons. But there are places too you can build in pockets of flexibility. So at Brooklyn Bridge Park, the first phase, which was done in the early 2000s, we allowed for rigid, hard, rocky edges, but created a section where there was a flexible beach. And this is a planting plan that shows the conditions that set up this beach, which is bounded by a series of stone terraces. And that's the beach. It was one of the very few places where people in Brooklyn could actually walk down on this side of Brooklyn, can walk down and dip their toes and look at the water and be in an area where you could put in a kayak. This is the terraced stairs behind it. There's the flexible beach, and it has moved around quite a bit. It has changed its position. We've put a lot of shells on top of it to create different sizes of voids. The shells got walked on quite a bit. New shells are being thrown up every now and then because there's active shellfish beds out here, but it's not like it's covering them. And this corner of it has shifted around. So it's been a great example of having a blend of flexibility within a rigid, more typical urban edge. Another project that is just being finished in construction is the restoration of a rocky shore in Pelham Bay Park, which is in the Bronx. This is the before condition, where we had a defunct drainage pipe 6 feet or 2 meters in diameter, great big concrete head wall and all kinds of boulders on top of it. And this was no longer needed for drainage. So we removed this whole infrastructure, which was intercepting and interrupting the beach. And not only the ability to walk along the beach, but for the ability for the beach to move around and be flexible as it needs to be in the face of changing conditions. The beach farther up from this area, farther in this direction, had been originally, or in the 20s and 30s, had a concrete wall built along it so that there was an esplanade. And we also took off this concrete wall, which had been built on top of a rocky shore. So the whole point of this was in an area which is a green park, not a highly urbanized park, but which has a relic of urban natural rocky shore, to rebuild and restore a natural drainage system, and to take away degraded and unnecessary structures, and to restore the habitat and connectivity between the upland and the water there. So this is it under construction, nearly done. This is where that pipe was, and now it's an open channel. Here it is at high, closer to high tide. Again, this is still in construction, and we have a section of it which is an archaeological site that needed to be protected. So we made a boulder wall over a portion of it. And in order to provide access across this open channel now where the pipe used to be, we now have a little culvert bridge. And that's what it looks like flowing. One of the collaborators on the book, Coastal Change, was Sylvia Earle, Dr. Sylvia Earle, a notable marine biologist with interest around the world in creating hotspots, protecting hotspots of biological activity in the ocean. Her wisdom brought into the ideas of architectural addressing shorelines includes the idea that the ocean is deep and expansive, but it's not infinite. And we know now that we humans need to take a much more active role in protecting it. And with care and global action, because of course the oceans touch on many, many jurisdictions, many different countries, many different cultures. So it requires global action. Some of the damages can be reversed. We know also from even a short period of time that once released from pollution and pressures, systems like rivers and oceans can bounce back dramatically. So there's quite a bit of hope for restoring these areas. So a few things to kind of leave you with, simple ideas you can kind of take home messages. By the way, this is a person swimming around the island of Manhattan with a protective chase boat every year. Maybe not this year, but for many years there have been a race around the city in the water. So some of the ways to create living urban edges is just to roughen the surfaces. Change it from standard, simple, straight, vertical, concrete and steel to forms that have shallow water, different types of voids, different types of materials that can support aquatic life. Reducing wave energy with porous areas and using durable but flexible materials instead of less durable, rigid, cracking materials that will just be destroyed by the water. Let's look at materials which are not destroyed in water movement, but which are flexible. So now I'm going back to open this for conversation. Okay.
Thank you so much, Marcha.
My pleasure.
Okay, let's hear from our students. Elif, do you have any questions? Or shall we just open the floor for questions first?
And comments. Maybe some of you have some other, not questions per se, but just some other thoughts or maybe even some disagreement with some of this, you know.
Thank you so much, Marcha. I think we will leave the floor to students for the time being, and then we can ask our questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Especially the people who do aquatic systems, you must have lots of questions.
Well, I have something that I do with my students. If we have silence like this, I might just pose a question to you. So let's give them another moment or two to see if they have anything they'd like to bring up. Otherwise, I can ask a few probing questions of you. Okay. So do you know of any locations in your world, in your city, that lend themselves to being changed from a canal or hard edge to some kind of hybrid or softer, softened, roughened edge? Can you think of any examples where this could be applied?
Did you understand the question? Are there any places in Istanbul that you can think of? Or any other liquid city that you lived in? Either you saw similar projects or you think these living shorelines concept could apply to?
In Istanbul, some shorelines are filled. Maybe this is the wrong city to ask the question, because the whole shoreline policy is let's fill more and more and more until it looks ridiculous. So I may recall Haliç shoreline and the Golden Horn shoreline things, and the Yenikapı may also work. I don't know. But it might be very strange to Marcha, because your projects are very, very well taught, and it has a research part, and it's in a way they are sustainable. You care about people and nature at the same time while designing the cities. In Istanbul, we don't often see that case.
So isn't there a fishing culture in Turkey? Have you next to all of these two bays, these two saltwater bodies plus the Bosphorus? Isn't it all very rich in fish? And isn't there a part of Turkish culture which celebrates and appreciates the richness of the food that you get from the water?
I guess I don't know. Do you want to answer, any of our students, or?
We have a culture like that, but it's just individually. There is no planning for it.
So one of the things that I noticed when I first came to New York 35 years ago, was the disconnect between the fishing community, the people who get, living by fishing, and the development and architectural community. They never talked to each other. They didn't really know, they didn't share information. And so one of the early things that I tried to do was to be a bridge between the people who understand what it takes to keep fish alive and to keep fish populations functioning, and the developers and architects and planners who didn't really have any idea about that. And over, a generation, there is a lot more discussion about it. I think there's still a lot to be learned, but there's a lot to be shared. It seems to me there's been some better understanding, but it took a lot, and from my observation, it's taking a very long time to get those people to talk together with each other. Usually the developers and architects talk to each other, and the environmental side kind of is a separate conversation. But once they start to talk together, they see that there are many ways that they can collaborate, and that might be something that could be done in addition to thinking from a planning perspective.
Can you give an example of that collaboration, result of that collaboration? Maybe?
Yeah, well, so some of it's not collaboration, but more lawsuits. So there are some energy, especially nuclear energy systems that need they take water from the Hudson River to cool the machinery, and then they put the hot water back into the. So when the water is being drawn in, their pipes were getting clogged with so many fish getting stuck on the intake that it was causing a noticeable drop in the fish populations. So the fishery community, there's a fishermen's association, brought a lawsuit to force the people involved with the structures of these nuclear energy intakes to put a grill, to put like a fence over the pipe so water can flow through, but the fish won't get stuck. And that was a huge, that's something that people can do for very little money, and it saves so much life. And it also avoids just wasting all of these fish, which would otherwise be edible from just like dying. So some of it wasn't collaboration as so much as raising the consciousness, raising the awareness of the problem by bringing, by objecting, by making a forceful argument that there is a better way to do things. Collaboration, I think, on the more collaborative side, there have been some conferences where the organizers deliberately try to mix people from different perspectives, and that's all can be very useful and enlightening. People that you don't normally talk to, people who know stuff that you don't know about, or are concerned with issues that but architecture community isn't so aware of. That can be very useful.
Can I ask you something, please?
Thank you very much.
Can I have a question?
I can't. Can you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And for me, it was like the first time to have such a clear idea how we have to, or how we should have an approach to a sustainable city in this particular coastal areas. And my question is, having such an approach in a design is quite different by having an opportunity to apply it. So applying these kind of approaches in New York or whenever in America is is self-initiative or is from government, and if it's so, like, we need advices how we can create a team somehow, how we can have an approach to do such a projects for Istanbul, because we need experience, and I guess we don't have so much. Actually, I am foreigner too. I am from Kosovo, but I live in Istanbul as I'm studying here. But I used to live here and to understand what is going on with these kind of policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just say that there's a lot to learn. New York City is far from sustainable. And when I propose ideas like this, they don't always get a big applause and, oh, great, let's just jump in and do it. Quite the opposite. I get a lot of, oh, maybe some other day, some other time, maybe it might be too expensive, maybe it might take too much effort, maybe we don't understand how to do it. I think that there is the value of a good idea just by itself, even if there isn't a lot of experience, a lot of proof sometimes an idea by itself can be very powerful. So where to start? If you have a culture, a community, government that really doesn't get it, they don't really have any attention, they haven't given it any attention, they don't want to put any money towards it, they don't really see it as their problem, the ocean, fish, like, what am I going to do about that? So I think that even people with very little power, like I will just say, in my place in the world, I'm not in charge of a lot of stuff. I don't get to say, do it my way, let's go. I get to say, I'd like to suggest we think about this idea, and sometimes the idea itself is strong enough to get others to repeat it and to consider it. Where I have had the opportunity, sometimes I've done it very quietly, just like, I'm just going to include this in my design and not make a big deal about it, not make it sound like it's super new or crazy or any of that, but just like, oh, I'm just going to do this, like something simple that doesn't cost anything, and then talk about it later if it works well. So that's one way to do it, is just to kind of like quietly, wherever the opportunity comes up, to make a small difference, and then talk about it later if it works. I mean, I'd like to say that it's possible to change minds at the top by just going to the decision makers and convincing them that there's a better way to do things and that it's beneficial and not going to cost very much. But in my experience, it's kind of hard to do that. People are more comfortable doing things that are wasteful and don't last very long and are ugly, just because that's how they know how to do it. So, you know, showing examples from other places, that's helpful. Showing that it can be done economically is also a big convincer, that nobody wants to like go into doing an experiment if it's going to be very expensive. But trying to shape the idea so that it has so that it's powerful enough to continue on its own. Once you stop saying it, have other people say it in a similar or different way. That's been also a way that minds can change. I don't have a real easy solution for that. It's, you know, it is something that I struggle with. I'm currently struggling with it right now. I'm working with engineers they're sort of interested, but I'm not sure we're actually going to build that reef ball EMOP system. It's not expensive, but I will have to see, but because people are very conservative about doing anything that they haven't done before. It's my observation.
One of our guests, she wants to discuss Kanal Istanbul, but before we do that, I mentioned that this might come up in our Q&A, but I think one of the significant takeaways, which I want to highlight for our students, is that how your work takes cultural ecology or cultural ecosystems into the actual design of things, which I was really impressed by that project of tide pools in Harlem. I mean, you understand how people who are the users in the immediate project area and what their needs are, because usually we keep human species different than other living species. So this is a very integrative approach to designing shorelines, including the needs of people, users, as well as the creating opportunities for habitats for other species. I think that sort of lacks mostly in design in Turkey. I'm guessing it's mostly lax in the elsewhere in the United States, and New York might be, due to your efforts, perhaps a unique sort of place. But so coming back to Kanal Istanbul, I guess we could talk about the ecological destruction, what you might see will happen. And you mentioned the freshwater systems and their destruction, but beyond that, what do you see?
Well, I'm not an expert on Kanal Istanbul. I've read a couple of articles about it and looked at some pictures, but you guys are on the forefront of understanding what the benefits and also the impacts or costs, cultural and ecological costs are likely to be. From an outsider's perspective, that I've just, a little very superficial understanding of it. One of the big problems is that it goes through very vulnerable green spaces. And I understand the impetus to do that from a planning perspective, instead of having to displace, say, expensive hotels and big buildings. When planners look at a map and they see, oh, this is green space, it will be much less destructive, be much easier to build through there than it would be to build through the middle of the city. In a place like an urbanized waterfront, a coastal city, those green spaces are precious and few. And when they disappear, it's very hard to get them back. So one thing that I think is likely to happen is that the environmental degradation from that canal is going to make portions of, could make portions of Istanbul less safe and less healthy to live in. I understand that the wastewater process that Istanbul uses to flush out urban waste would be compromised by the connection between the two water bodies. And the loss of that green space means both, the loss of oxygenating and cooling space, that in a place which really needs that, which really needs some refuge and some cleansing qualities of green space, but also the psychological quality of green space. One of the things that we've all noticed during this pandemic in New York and around the world is people so much need connectivity with green space. They need to go sit under a tree someplace. They need to just get out of their boxes and go be in a greener, cleaner environment where there are birds and other animals and butterflies. We as humans become more human when we have green spaces to spend some time in. So the loss of that seems to me to be avoidable and very urgent.
Can I say something? Okay.
Yes, please.
I just want to add something here because I don't know too much about the Kanal Istanbul, but I read some articles and stuff, and I know the situation, and I don't want to talk about that, but sometimes I see that we are creating two parties. The first party that is thinking for the city, for the growth of the city, because Istanbul is growing too much. Like we are maybe in 10 next years, there are 20 million people living here. And we need a solution, urban solution, spaces to the people here. I don't know if this is not the best solution, but we need to make a space for people to live here because they want to live here. or if we don't want to take the people living here, that's another solution. Now, we need a space to live for a new people that they are planning to live here. But at the same time, we want to save the green spaces. Now, what we have the people, the government that is thinking how we should grow the city, in which lines of the city or green spaces, because like if we build something, we destroy somehow a green space and we build a building to live there. And in this time, what I'm just trying to understand is we have a government that wants to create a space for a living space for people, and the other party that just want to save the green spaces but not give a solution for these living spaces, you know. And sometimes we just we go to the opposite side just to save something, but we don't give a solution for something that is very necessary. So my idea is, or my ask, not question, but how we can grow Istanbul by having a sustainable approach somehow.
I think there it's hard to have those two objectives equally. And the term sustainable is a critical aspect of this thinking. The model that growth is necessary for a healthy economy, and that more people is a necessity, is a good thing that we should stimulate. That is not compatible with the idea of living sustainably. We can't, at some point, and this is just my opinion, we have to come up with a different model for what it means to have a good, healthy economy. We can't grow, I mean, human beings have grown and grown and grown in population, and cities have grown and grown and grown. There must be a stopping point, because we already have exceeded the space which we should have in the globe, on the earth. We should look at having and this might be something where we look at what traditional cultures did. How did they manage to stay alive and have interesting and wonderful lives for thousands and thousands of years in these same coastal areas without destroying the world and having unlimited growth? I think we need to look at a different type of model for a healthy economy that provides for a high level of lifestyle, good health care, good food, healthy environment, without continuing to grow and grow and grow and grow endlessly. It's my observation that, at least in New York and in this era, that our leadership lacks the idea of having a cap on growth, of having limitations on growth. The only model which seems to be viable is grow and grow and grow. And I think it's just incompatible with long-term survival in the world. We can't every city can't be growing endlessly and expect to have a good, healthy population without just destroying the world. We need a different model. This is a moment, I think, as a whole globe, as a whole world, to look for better ways to do this. Just building more buildings is not going to get us there.
Especially given the climate crisis and disappearing resources. And last week, our guest said that most of our Istanbul's drinking water comes kilometers away now, because it cannot sustain the population of, I don't know, is it now 18 million with the metropolitan area? So, we're thinking about the resources, it seems like a really, really difficult problem to address.
Yeah. Well, finding an alternative to growth is not going to be an easy sell to developers and to governments that depend on the income from this endless growth. But I don't see how we can continue to grow like that. We're running out of space. We're running out of places for people to live, and we're running out of resources to sustain ourselves on a massive level. We need to have a new approach to how cities, what the role is of cities, and how to understand how to control the growth, reduce it. It's not. I don't have an easy pat answer, but I see that as a heart of the problem is our economic model.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, one of the problems that Istanbul has that is growing so rapidly is because the Turkey itself as a country is has a concentrated economy. Like the Istanbul is the most important city in Turkey, and all the people want to live here because the money are here, the economy is here. And for example, in other side we have the Germany that is not a concentrated economy and has 4 or 5 strong cities that create somehow the state with a standing economy that is separated in a different places, in a different cities. And because that the Turkey has this kind of economy that is concentrated in one city, actually 2 or 3, it creates these kind of large city spaces. So I think it's much deeper than just given a small solution or for particular spaces. It needs much more, it needs a vision for Turkey as a country, not as a Istanbul as a city somehow. Because even if we give a solution for Istanbul, the problem is the people always want to live in Istanbul because the opportunities is just here, not in the other places or cities.
Definitely. That's the problem for so many metropolitan cities where people want to migrate to. Thank you, Ibrahim. Do we have other questions?
I have a question, but my connection is very unstable. If you could give me a couple of minutes, I'll go on to the next.
It looks fine.
It's fine now? That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again, Marcha. I think it's really important in this sense. You were talking about not making a big deal about the techniques used. So it's almost by stealth that we are, trying to propose ecological solutions. And I was going to ask you whether, in terms of raising awareness, whether other research like Eric Sanderson's Manhattan research contributes to the awareness about the natural sort of history of the city itself. Did it help in any way to raise awareness about these ecological issues? Or I just wanted to ask you your opinion about that.
Yes, it definitely has caught people's imagination. And for those of you that don't know about that, it's a book where a person collected a lot of maps, historic maps of the city, and then illustrate artistically, like a rendering, what the pre-European settlement conditions would be like here. So yes, it's caught a lot of imagination. It's very pretty. It's very, aesthetic. He did a beautiful job of packaging his ideas in a very nice graphic way. And it has been very useful, I think, in raising awareness. I think to Ibrahim's point, that there is still a lack of interest, I guess it is, on the part of some of the engineers and architects and designers, including landscape architects, in applying that. So it's great to have that resource. What could it look like? What could it have looked like? What could it be in the future? It's a good backup for proposed solutions, greener solutions. But there is also the other side of the coin, which is the fear of storms and water, particularly for hurricane, in response to hurricanes. There is a huge industry building itself around the idea of protection from the ocean, and barricades and walls and berms and levees. And so there is a lot of money to be made at the moment in the United States in coastal areas, promising protection from natural forces through gigantic engineering projects. And Japan, for example, is building some gigantic, huge concrete structures along its waterfront for the same kind of purpose. So as much as there is a new awareness of ecosystems, there's a tremendous amount of resources and research that's been done for those that are looking for it. The other side of the coin is that there is this manufactured fear, terror of what the ocean may do to us, that's creating a growth industry in building barricades. There's money to be made. And if I say, oh, I promise you can stay in this you can stay with your building in the low area, we're just going to build a big system to protect you. You can just stay there, you'll be fine. It's not true. And two, it's really ugly. And instead of feeling connection to the water, you will be looking at a wall. You'll be looking at the backside of a wall. So, you know, it's not a perfect world, and there's pros and cons and, you know, forward steps and backward steps at the same moment.
Marcha, isn't the Big U designed by Björk Engel's group for the Rebuild by Design competition a similar sort of undertaking?
Yeah, and that's in trouble because they are, I think they have to rethink their whole approach. But yeah, there have been proposals, well-funded proposals, for hiring the most, the best designers and the people with the, most interesting approaches. But for the idea that you're building protection in places where you can't really be completely protected. And it's just, I think it's it's an illusion that is being promoted heavily from the perspective of people who look at land as something that they can look at shoreline land as something that you can own, that you can prevent the ocean from being taking part in. And I think it's wrong-headed, but it's going to cost. I think where we are at the moment is on the cusp of learning some hard lessons as a culture. And so we're going to make some big mistakes, really big, expensive mistakes. And then my hope is that we go, oh, we shouldn't have done that, and move on to a more enlightened perspective. But I think we're going to make some big mistakes first.
Hopefully before it's not too late.
Yeah, hopefully before it's not too late. I mean, in many ways, it's too late for some things, but we know that the Earth is resilient. If human beings cost ourselves to revert to smaller populations, the Earth will rebound and will recover. It's our human cultures that are at most risk by stubborn and obstinate and arrogant thinking.
Thank you. I do have one technical question. Most of those systems that you have showed us, they are for saltwater ecosystems. And I was wondering, do the same principles apply to freshwater systems? Because a few of our students are working in lakes, kind of large size lakes in Istanbul.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. The reason I'm showing these coastal systems is because that's where I'm actually working. And so I've been focused on that. But absolutely, freshwater systems are just as many of those ideas of having greener edges and diversity and micro conditions, that absolutely applies to freshwater as well, at many scales.
Thank you.
I also have a technical question. You talked about materials, and I was wondering about the leaching of concrete material to aquatic ecosystems. Does it create a negative environment for certain species, or does it change the acidity of the water if not used properly? And I'm mainly thinking about the landfill areas, and because they're all composed of construction waste, and they're just dumped on the seashores to create these hard edges that you're talking about most of the time. And I was wondering how it affects the ecosystems, both marine and also freshwater ecosystems.
So I'm not an expert on concrete degradation in marine systems, but it's my understanding from talking to marine engineers and marine ecologists that our traditional concrete, and you know, there are many formulas of concrete, but the kind that is most often used in the United States in underwater conditions is called tremie concrete. And it's my understanding that when it degrades, when it eventually breaks apart and releases chemicals into the water, that it is very destructive. It has a lot of toxic materials. People have been using concrete on waterfronts probably since the Romans, some type of concretes. So I'm not comfortable saying universally it's all the same. I don't think it is. I think these different formulations are different. But you know, what I can do, Elif, is I try to send you a link for somebody that might be able to answer that more accurately with more understanding. But it's my understanding that the eco-concrete folks have studied different types of concrete, and the reason that they're promoting that particular material, actually their eco-concrete, they have various formulations for different purposes as well. So it's my understanding that there are much better forms of concrete than the traditional one, and it's sometimes these alternative forms are actually stronger, have more adhesion and more compressibility than the traditional ones. But at the end of the day, concrete is not benign in the marine environment. It does release toxic chemicals that aren't good for marine organisms or for our structures, that they are corrosive chemicals, so that we're making the water environment more destructive to our own infrastructure as well as to the biology. So I'll see what I can send you, because it's not my area of expertise, really.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sorry, Ibrahim Aslan Demirtaş, who is a guest, wants to make a comment, and then we'll get back to you. Is that okay? Thanks.
Yeah, I had a question to Ibrahim. Are you from Pristina or Prizren? Hello.
Hello, I am from Pristina.
Good. Okay, because I thought you may be able to talk about the Lombardy River a little bit if you were from Prizren or even from Pristina.
Actually, in Pristina, we have underground rivers. So we put 2 rivers in one canal. So it's worse.
Exactly. I mean, I didn't want to bomb the class as a guest, but I was writing to Elif, and finally, I think she was like, talk about it. Marcia, it's been such a pleasure, and I was trying to find a way how if the students could discuss. And I think when you start contextualizing the material within your own framework, your questions are going to start to pile up, because I'm feeling that all this water edge studies and sections and this whole need for absorption, etc., is coming from the fact that the evil for New York is flooding in the future in the context of climate crisis. And the evil for Istanbul in the context of climate crisis is basically when we're going to talk about flooding, it's usually flooding through in the valleys when it rains so much in Istanbul, where there's habitation and all the riverbeds starts to fill up. And I think if you can maybe start contextualizing what Marcia was presenting in terms of how to create edges or surfaces that actually act like the natural system as opposed to water dams. So maybe you can also start thinking about that. I mean, our evil, the most of our evils is the earthquake we're waiting. But then in Izmir, we saw that there was a tsunami also, although for Istanbul, that has been a low risk, they have been saying, but I don't know too good about that. So I just wanted to add that the whole river system, the valley system of Istanbul would be very comparable to what I think Marcia is talking about in terms of New York's geography. And hi, Zeynep.
Thank you so much for the contribution. The students are eerily silent today, but thanks, Ibrahim, for keeping the discussion going. What question did you want to ask?
Actually, the question is, as me myself are part of the human-made ecology and some kind of urban ecology, we have Istanbul in the two sides of Bosphor. So because we have a living near to the sea, like we have houses and spaces to live there, we must somehow, or this is the approach from government, we have to build the platforms for people to have a connection with the Bosphor, for the fisher that they do fishing. And I saw in your presentation some of the sections with these kind of platforms. So are these platforms, these sketches, or these approaches that you did in New York something that we can probably have the same approach here in Istanbul? Because like the Bosphor, in the two sides of the Bosphor, we have a huge and large platforms with concrete that the people use them as squares, as a place to stay there, hanging out and just having fun. So in these kind of spaces when we need platforms, is that appropriate for us to?
Okay, I'm not comfortable saying you should do this or that. I don't know Istanbul and I don't know the context for that. So I would say I'm just not, I'm not here to tell you what to do. That would be inappropriate. I just don't know that space at all. However, I think that in general, if you look at the way the natural conditions were on those water edges, if you can have both, if you can elevate the location where people have these platforms, but allow the water underneath to do what it would naturally do, that would probably be better than displacing all of the natural processes and solidifying it and making it just concrete. Many, many years ago, it didn't matter so much. We have cities that would build, you know, hard edges, but the cities were smaller, and there was the proportion of natural to hardened and urbanized was so different. Now it really matters because we don't have as much natural green space and natural uncontrolled rivers as we used to. So we've lost a lot of that. So I think it makes it more urgent to come up with different solutions than what our traditional historic city centers might have looked like. But I can't speak to the specifics of Istanbul. I'm sorry. I feel it would be not relevant because I don't really know it that well.
But I think there are definitely a cultural difference in terms of using in historical uses of these waterfront shorelines. I think in Istanbul, it's more for pleasure, for entertainment is used, but whereas in New York, it was mostly industrial up to a certain point. Now these piers like Brooklyn Bridge Park, they are converted or transformed into parks. But I think historically Istanbul had more of a use for leisure activities, although I might have to add, like in the recent decade, it's more privatized use, especially in the area of Karaköy, that their places are turning into hotels and developed that cuts people off the access. But I guess one last point I want to make is the role of technology and the scalability. Given that, so I looked, I know New York has 520 miles of shorelines. I think Istanbul does have about 300. And they are mostly used by people for so many different activities. But in terms of redesigning these shorelines, let's say that, we have a responsible sort of initiative that collaborates, people and the government and through well-made policies. I don't think technology has to be a huge part of it, like the eco-concrete or stuff like that, or big infrastructure projects. But I think it will come through more like what you showed, more traditional techniques of returning the shorelines into living shorelines. But I wonder, what do you think about the scalability of it? Can these solutions be applied in a large-scale transformation of shorelines?
Well, I don't see why not. But while you were talking, it reminded me of the section of Dubai, which has the kind of plazas that Ibrahim was talking about, where people come out and stroll, and it's the place where there's gatherings. And at least in Dubai, I don't know if this is true for Istanbul. Is part of it built on coral reefs? Are there coral stone in the building materials? Is that one of the traditional building materials of Turkey? I did not understand. Do you use coral as a building material?
You mean shells and stuff?
Coral, pieces of coral cut into stone. So in Dubai, at the water's edge, some of their seawalls are built of coral stone. That may not be relevant if they haven't done that in the past. But that's it's a kind of a model for a material which is hard, durable in the marine environment, but full of pores and capable of supporting living organisms.
Those of you who have your microphones on, can you please turn it off? We can hear your talking. Thank you.
Anyway, I think it doesn't have to be either or. I think it's a delightful thing to be able to come down to the waterfront plazas and have, you know, music and gatherings and celebrations and just walk around. It's a wonderful thing. I don't think it needs to be all one or all the other. I think that combining it is the way to do it.
Marcha, I just shared some pictures, some of the sites of Istanbul. There are two different approaches. One is natural, and as far as I know, with the stones, and the other are these concrete platforms that we see often in around the Bosphorus. So these platforms we have almost everywhere in Bosphorus edges. And we have some of these edges with these kind of stones, big stones around the sea.
I'm having trouble opening those, but I'll look for it later.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if you do not have any more questions, I think we should let our guest go to her next meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much, Marcha.
It was a pleasure. So what I have on my list of things to do is to send a link to NF for concrete information about weathering concrete impacts. And what else did I say I was going to do? Was there anything else I was going to follow up with?
You were sent some of the either the presentation or a few slides that you were talking about the material in Australia they developed underwater.
Okay, I'll send the PDF. Okay. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Take care of the day. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Zeynep Hocam, is there any possibility to have that presentation or
have that?
The presentation, Marcha's presentation, because I heard that she said that probably.
Oh, she's gonna send me.
Okay, perfect.
The PDF, I hope.
Okay.
But I'll remind her if she doesn't. Okay.
Okay.
And she already sent a PDF to us.
But it's not the same edit. Yeah.
Presentation. I mean,
because these sections were beautiful, I like so much.
Sorry, what?
No, nothing. The presentation was perfect.
Okay. Thank you all of those who are outside the studio for coming and contributing. You contributed more than some of our students, so thanks. And we will be niye Türkçe konuşmuyorum
İbrahim.
Evet, Türkçe geçelim. Yani bu bir dil sorunu muydu anlamadım ama hani dil sorunu bile olsa kaydı da kapatıyorum. Pardon, bunu da kapatayım.
Siz bu konuşmayı yapmadan önce ben veda edebilir miyim? Böyle gergin konuşmalarda çok şey oluyorum.